We're here today to talk to Uncle Herb, who's Uncle Herb Roberts. So, what can I get you to introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, absolutely. As Stuart said, Uncle Herb Roberts. I'm a Widjabul Wibble man of the Bundjalung Nation, and also a Banjalang man, and I can't think of the tribe from Bayugal, but part of that as well. I've actually, this September coming, which will be 2023, not September, sorry, July 2023, will be 61 years I've lived in Evans Head. So I've actually become a local. They always said you had to be 50 years before you can be local. Well, I'm 61 years.
Well, that's always interesting. We sort of say that to the non-Indigenous lot because we're always local wherever we go.
Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, it's really interesting that's the case. And it's 61 years in the one space is really will add to the conversation that we're about to have, in the sense that we're here today to continue a series that we've been doing on talking with our elders about your journey with education.
Yep.
So can you tell us a little bit about what the education was like for you in the early days? And
When I went through kindy to grade 6 at Evans Head Public School, I really enjoyed those years. However, the racism was really, really horrendous and horrible. And for most of that schooling, I was basically the only Aboriginal student at that school. So my education, I dropped out of school, basically the start of my second year in high school because of the racism. I'd done homeschooling, which got me to where I am today and the knowledge I know.
can you talk to us a little bit about what homeschooling was for you? What does that mean for you?
Homeschooling back then, and I've got a really good memory of my early years. Homeschooling was great because you didn't have to get up and go to school. However, I was pushed by parents to continue your education and that. But I did find it frustrating and hard, and the stuff that I was doing at home, where you didn't have that on-call teacher, because we didn't have phones back then, like mobile phones. We didn't have a landline on, and so it was great in a sense, but it was also bad in a sense because there wasn't that interaction with other students. I had a great network of friends from school who I still have that great connection with this very day. We always stay in contact with each other, and just fantastic. It is. But yeah, homeschooling was totally different. You never had that one-on-one support when you wanted it, but it got me through to where I am when I left school and into the workforce. I've held some pretty high positions in my working career, and I think it was all because of the morals that I was brought up with. Because my life started on an Aboriginal community, which back in them days were called missions, and they were never a lifestyle choice. We were forced there. We weren't allowed to leave there without permission. And the community, we now call them communities. It was called Kabawi. And for those who know the area, if you're going from South Lismore to Kyogle, just out of Lismore before you cross the railway line, right beside the railway line on your right-hand side, north side, is a gate, and that was the gate into our community. But directly on the left side, there was a school, specifically for the local area and for the Aboriginal students. Because I had some paperwork. I was the one back in the bicentenary, done a lot of cultural awareness with a lot of government officers in Lismore. And I was working for the Department of Social Security, what it was called then, for many years, and I was given all this information, booklets and everything to hand out, and they were the best, most fantastic books I've ever come across for local knowledge and schooling and people doing Aboriginal cultural awareness. But sadly, like a lot of my stuff, they were taken and never ever recovered, and I don't know what happened to them. But I'd loved, and I often think about it, I did have some in my lawn locker at home, but they were taken out of there as well. So, and it talked about the education policy back in the early days, the segregation of schools. One side was for Aboriginal people, the other side were for non-Aboriginal people. Talking of education, my son, who is now in his 30s, 35, he started high school in 2000 when they built the new K-12 high school in Evans. They're top of the states, top of the art, everything, school in New South Wales. However, he dropped out of school and he attended Lismore. But the same thing happened to him in Woodburn. My son's mother is non-Aboriginal, and my son back then was blonde-haired, freckled and everything, but his soul was he was such a proud young Aboriginal boy. He held his pride so well. However, he said to me one day, and he was nearly in tears, he said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about something." I said, "Yeah," and I said, "What?" And he said, "The kids at school don't know I'm Aboriginal." I went, "And?" He said, "I've never seen so much racism in my life." Primary school I enjoyed, even though the racism was there. I fought it with perseverance. Like I said, I got upset quite a few times and thinking, why? And I questioned my parents, why was I born black? And that just made me so annoying, and that's why I wanted to drop out of school, because of the racism that was there. With the new opening of the Evans Ed K-12 school, there was a lot of problems there because my son ended up attending there as well. But and my daughter, and I actually my three kids all attended the K-12. They dropped out of school and I had to get them into Lismore. However, in saying that, so did every other Aboriginal parent who had kids at that school. I'm talking about Coraki, Woodburn, Evans Ed. Every Aboriginal kid was pulled from that school because of the racism.
We were talking about your sons having, to deal with racism at the same sort of level that you had to deal with. So how did that make you feel when you realised that the racism hadn't changed at all in the education space?
It made me feel really angry, to be honest. I thought a lot of that in schooling was dealt with and over and done with. I know today there's racism all around the world, no matter where you go. But what really shocked me, as I said, with pulling my children out of school, was that every other Aboriginal parent pulled their kids out because they were copying the same thing. However, it's got a really good group, because when that school opening, we, as the Roberts family and our connection to Evans Ed, we actually done, my brother Oral Roberts done a massive, and my brother Sheldon Arrington actually done a massive cutout of a goanna and a snake, and they put it on a piece of board and not laminated it, cut out, and as a goodwill gesture, we actually donated that to the school because of the Dreamtime story of how Goanna Headland came to be. And I actually done the story and framed it, put underneath so it hangs in the main office. And when that was presented, it was just absolutely blown. The principal didn't know about it. We snuck it into the opening where the gymnasium is, and so much dedication was put into that school and the news opening and that. And our like I said, the early days of that new school was just filled with so much racism. And it took them a very long time to change that. And what surprised me, as I said just a minute ago, was that every parent pulled their child out of that school.
Yep.
And that's, it's top of the state, art, education, everything was just, there was a big write-up about it. And it is a brilliant school, the layout and everything. It was just so sad back then that all this happened. So regardless of where we go today and tomorrow and the future, racism will never ever be wiped out.
No, and that's true. But the beauty of that story is that we're seeing Evans Head High, this school up here, is one of the, it has a very strong cultural connection now.
Oh,
that
yes.
Yeah, so they've come from a very heavily racist environment to one that's very very strong in support of Indigenous people in this area, and they have a very solid Indigenous education program, and they have a bush tucker garden and all of that sort of stuff, which
it is really good to see where it is today. Prior to moving here, we used to walk from Cubbuy to Evans Head.
Wow.
And I said, how'd you get the tents and everything? Because we actually lived in a tent. And back in them days, it was the old marquee tents. None of these new modern floors.
Ones.
And where we were situated was the whole community of Cubbuy, Cabbage Tree Island would all camp along there, just north of the surf club at Evans Head, because they had the caravan park, but we were never allowed in there because of our colour. And I do have memories of that. And I've got family members who's in their 80s. And I said, how far can you go back of us camping there? And they said, when I was a child, very young child. So I'm talking about 90 to probably 100 years ago now of us doing that. It was situated between the sand dunes and the swamp, which is still there to this day. So you had to be very careful of snakes and that. I remember our tent, and I've got photos of it at home. We had carpet on the ground. We had normal beds in the tent and that. And I said, how did we get them down? And they said, from Cubbuy, there was a farmer, an Italian farmer, and he used to, the family members from Cubbuy would pay him to take all the stuff down and drop it off there. Then once the tents were erected and everything, come the colder months, we'd move back to Cubbuy. However, we'd leave the tent standing because there was no vandalism back in them days. And people didn't want to touch them because they were blackfellas and they might get black on them, basically is what we were told. So that's because Evans Head is the birthplace of the Bundjalung Nation by three brothers, their wives, their grandmother. And so Evans Head holds great significance and history to me.
Yeah, you were talking about Evans Head being the birthplace of the Bundjalung Nation and the significance of this place for the Bundjalung Nation, the Aboriginal people in the Bundjalung Nation. As we continue to think about your education and that sort of stuff, who was your cultural educator in that space? So where did you find out what you know about country and place? And
my cultural education was through the elders.
Right.
And I'm talking about elders who have long gone many, 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 many years ago. So I'm talking as a young kid brought up. Spiritually, I've experienced so much stuff that people would think I'm mad if I told some of the stories that I've experienced, that I've been through. It's a spiritual thing I knew about, knowing things before things happen, knowing loved ones were going to pass over, not knowing exactly who it was, but I experienced so much they'd always come and visit me in the house. And I remember, I'm probably getting a bit off the line at what we were actually talking about, but
It's all right.
in particular there was 2 incidents. There was, sitting down at home one night watching telly, and I had this strong sense someone was in the room with me. I'm sitting and I'm actually looking around in the lounge room like that, and it was so powerful. And I ended up getting up and saying, "Who are you?" And I went right through the house, and my dear old mum was alive then, and she says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Someone's in the house." I said, "I don't know who." I said it, and I know it wasn't a live person. And she said, "We're going to get bad news tomorrow." And sure enough, we did. The late Uncle Frank Roberts, who Junior, Rhoda Roberts' father, he was actually reared by people who reared me. And he had an heart attack about 3 o'clock that morning. So he's basically come to say goodbye. His brother, Uncle Fletcher Roberts, who I had a very close connection with, a man I deeply cared about. He was a very cultural, spiritual man. So learning went on until all these elders have gone. And I'm talking about me 30s. I'm still, and even today, I mean, we still, as humans, we learn. Every day's a learning day, regardless of how old we are.
That's right.
Uncle Fletcher came to me the night after his funeral, the night of his funeral. One of our oldest elders we've got so far, Auntie Irene Arrington. I was living in Lisbon because my son was attending this school and he wanted me to move up there. And I remember Auntie Irene coming in and waking me, said, "Get up, can you go outside and check? Someone's knocking on the windows." And I just, from a dead sleep, I said, "It's Uncle Fletcher coming to say goodbye and thank you," because I actually done everything, organised the best funeral going. I involved Guinea, was what was the name of Gundle Jiddabar back them days,
Gundle Jindaba.
and got them involved to do the pamphlets and everything, and gave him the best send off. And he actually came. It was him that came to say goodbye and thank you.
Cool.
I walked outside and just said, "Thanks, Unc. You know I love you. Safe trip." And I've come back and laid in the bed I was in, and there was a tap on my window, and I said, like, closer than you and I are at the moment. And I just put my hand up in the wave and said, "Travel safe, Unc. You know I love you." And so I've got that spiritual connection with the land, with the country. And after years of my daughter talking about this and wanting to know it, I realised what she was talking about. I said, I don't know if it's a good thing, because back then I actually took it as a curse, because why was I being tormented? Why was I seeing people that no one else could see? But it was all through my education. When I say education, listening to the elders. We were always told not to interrupt, like the kids today. You're talking about something, they'll butt in and ask you this and ask you that, which is good, but not while an elder's talking. And my education was sitting down listening to the elders, and I'm thinking, same thing if I told you a lot of things I've been through, to the younger generation who will hopefully see these recordings. I learned more through our culture than what the school actually taught me.
Yep.
One of the things I found very frustrating when I realised, I was a teenager then, I went through school taught that Captain Cook discovered Australia, met all the Aboriginal people, and we all lived happily ever after. What a load of crap that was when I found out the truth, and what is still happening today. You know, there's so much media coverage about the youth crime that's happening on the Sunshine Coast, Darwin, Alice Springs, everywhere. So where were we?
I've got no idea.
I mean, either. Something I was going to tell you about.
You were talking about your daughter wanting to know.
The knowledge and understanding. Like I was saying, I've got a great memory of Kabawee. Now, I left Kabawee when I was about 4 years old, 4.5 years old, and we moved to Evans Head. We had the option of moving to, I don't know, people who know the community, Aboriginal community of Gundarimba in Lismore. They're the original inhabitants who were moved from Kabawee because, to be not being rude, but you only had to piddle in the river out there and it would flood. Many times as a young kid, I remember standing on Norton's Gap and all you could see of the community with the roofs of the houses. That's how bad it was. And like I said, it wasn't a lifestyle choice. We were forced there because of them back in the mission days, and we weren't allowed to leave that community unless we got permission off the caretaker to go into town, and we'd walk from there into Lismore. And I remember walking that road many a times. So we had the option of moving to Gundarimba or Evans Head, but because of our lifestyle in Evans Head, we decided to move here to Evans Head. But my spiritual side of it, and it's all part of education and learning.
That's right.
And I remember, and I was funny thing, I was only thinking about it this morning before you arrived, of where our house was. We had a big willow tree. Dad had a big chook pen and had white pebbles inside the chook pen. And right behind us was the boundary fence, and there was a big drain. And I remembered on one occasion I climbed through the fence, which was probably only from here to that tree over there, and sitting in there playing, and someone was watching me, and it was so powerful. But I'm playing, and as a kid, you're inquisitive, and you're looking around and thinking, and I got so bad that I can't be here, someone. And I knew it wasn't something good, it was something bad that was watching me. And I just knew within myself, I've got to move from here. And I think, to talk about education, learning my culture, my background, my ancestry history and everything, I actually found that more interesting than what I was learning at school. I know that schooling education is very important to all of us, to learn to read, write, the history of the world and that. But culturally is more, to me it was more experience, more something I really enjoyed learning, and I said especially listening to the old people talk of their experience of that and the journeys as a young child to other communities and involvement with family in other things. It was all part of my cultural education. So that was something I still hold very dear today, and it's still something that we learn every day, regardless of how old we are. We learn, and we're still picking up. And I'll learn something new today. I'll learn something new tomorrow.
Absolutely, and I think one of my elders once said to me, if you stop learning, you're dead. So, while we're alive, there's still an opportunity to learn something.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really enjoy at the moment is when you elders, the Guinevere Elders group, get together for our meetings and you're sitting around talking with one another, just being in the room, not actually engaging in the conversation, but listening to what's happening around the place. You learn so much stuff by just sitting and absorbing what the elders are saying, and that sounds like what you were doing when you were younger. As you were growing up, you were just
absolutely
engaging with the elders and just sitting with them. How long have you been connected with university? You obviously haven't had any sort of formal education past your high school.
No, I haven't. However, with the university involvement, I had to give up my working career at an early age. I was actually in my 40s when I'd done it, due to a back problem, which is still ongoing today. But I got invited by an elder, and because I'm Widjabul, and as we all know, the university is on Widjabul land of the Bundjalung Nation, and I got invited and actually onto we didn't have such a, I don't know if I'm going to call it a group or a gathering like what we have today. I think there was only just a handful of us. When I say handful, it was probably about four or five of us that were involved back then. So I'm talking about probably, I think it was 2015. 2014, 2015 anyway, my involvement with the uni. And it's something that I really, really enjoy doing, especially when we have that caring for country classes and that. Especially when we have overseas students that are involved with it. And what we go through in teaching, telling them and trying to teach them the history of what we had to fight and how we got to where we are. It's surprising because a lot of these students don't know anything about Aboriginal culture.
No.
And for us to be in there, and I'm very proud to be a part of Guinevere. I love it. And I love teaching in our caring for country and working within communities. Because all my working jobs were involved working out in communities. I had one particular job that I really enjoyed. It was so interesting. It was the court officer at the Lismore Courthouse. But I was stuck in the building all day, every day. I knew I wasn't getting out in the community. And I was fortunate enough to get a phone call from Juvenile Justice to say, would I backfill this woman's position for 12 months while she was on leave? And I tried to get leave without pay from the court. And they said, no, we can't. You've only just started here. And I said, well, I'll resign then, which I did. Because I knew I'd pick work up again, which after that 12 months, which I did. So the important side of it is as I said, teaching the knowledge, what I know, to the students. But the elders group that we have now is also very important because it's a great get-together. Just in the background of where we are, across the river here, was a camping ground for the nation. And when I talk about the nation, it was covering from Yugambeh country up in Queensland, the Gold Coast, down to the Clarence, Coffs Gumbanga land. They'd all meet here a certain time of the year, but when whatever food was plentiful, they'd all bring and share, and the history, and that's, I'll put this in there, that's where they want to do that development of that new community on this place. Now that was all actually sand mined many, many years ago, from Chinaman's Beach right through to the end of the Evans Head Strait. All across there was mined, and there was a lot of desecration of sites there. I was told by a couple of elders of two warriors that were elders that are buried over there. With that development, there was a circle of trees that were growing there, and in the centre of that circle was two bigger trees. And what I was told and what I was taught about those trees, I did see them. They got desecrated with that new housing development. But the two trees in the middle, the bigger one, represented the hierarchy of the Bundjalung Nation, which we didn't have kings and queens such as what we have today. And when he died, he was buried. And then the next tree is the next carrier of knowledge, the hierarchy of that tribe. And the 13 trees represented the 13 nations within the Bundjalung tribes, sorry, the 13 tribes within the Bundjalung Nation. So it's very spiritual, it's very cultural there. Evans Head is, as I said, is the birthplace of the Bundjalung Nation, and directly behind me, up the river, we have the Midden. There's also the local campground of the local tribes in the local area that used to camp there. There's an initiation spot, which I found out about a few years ago. There's freshwater wells up there. So food was plentiful back in them days. And the history, I've experienced cultural things. There's an old quarry on the other side of the river here called Blue Pool. It's a very popular swimming place. It was back in my teenage and early 20s, early 30s, of partying out there and swimming. And I experienced things that I can't explain that I saw a couple of times out there. And I thought, oh, we shouldn't be here. And finding out, like I said, every day is a learning day. And it was, years after that I found out about these graves and about the history of the tribes gathering here today, back in them days. Just something also important is that every Boxing Day, Evans Head is so full of the local communities. Lismore, Casino, and even Cabbage Tree Island all come to Evans Head. And what we say within our own respect and our own culture, we're having a blackout. There was so many black people in Evans Head. And like I said, the reason we lived in those tents when I was young was because we weren't allowed in the caravan park. There was, when we moved here, there was a petition taken up by a local woman who used to own just around the corner from where I live, a small caravan park, mainly made up of permanent residents. And she ran a local paper called The Triangle. It was all the local news of the lower Richmond River. But she took up a petition because there was these black people moving to Evans Head, and they didn't want Aboriginal people living here. We ignored that. We copped a lot of racism back then. But we had people driving out, because Mum was a mad gardener of flowers. The whole front yard was just garden beds, flower beds. I remember winning the garden competition many times. The whole backyard was a veggie garden. We were self-sufficient. And right at the very back of our yard was a massive big chook pen. So we had, we wanted chicken, Dad would go and chop its head off. Gut it, defeather it and everything, and then we'd have hot roast chicken for dinner of a night, veggies from our own garden. So we were all self-sufficient. But it's just, it was sad that what we had to fight through to be in Evans Head. And people forget about the cultural side of it being the birthplace of the Bundjalung Nation. And it's a very important to students who are listening. Don't take particular notice of what you read. It's not fully accurate, a lot of stuff. And
Not always, no.
And I've found that so often, the stuff I've read about local history, Aboriginal history, and I think that's not right. But it's just, that's all part of the learning as well, is the cultural side.
I think the cultural side is really important, and it's one of the things that the Elders Council brings to Gnibi is a cultural perspective, but it also helps keep Gnibi on track around its mandate for supporting our young people and who come to university
Yep.
and that sort of stuff. So, just as a final thing, what we're thinking about Guinevere and the Elders Council at Southern Cross University. What is one of the most important things that you can say about your support and what it does for you?
My support, and I've been given it a lot of thought lately, is teaching the students that come through, especially with our caring for country and our working within communities, the history, our history, because as I said, we do have overseas students in it, and it's interesting the feedback that I get from students, and I've met some great students over the years. It's great students who I'm still in contact with, but it's teaching them and giving them an understanding, and it's something I'm so passionate about. Because the more we educate people, the more better understanding they're going to have with Aboriginal culture. Because just another thing on that, with our own the generation today, the younger generation, is that when you talk about the dream time, they associate it with the dream time, dreaming, that happened many, many years ago. And as an elder of the Bundjalung Nation, the dream time to me, and I've actually had this conversation with many elders, the dream time's becoming more stronger and stronger than what it was many years ago. And which is something great, because, and it's important what we're doing, because in time to come, the generations that lived through what I lived through would have not experienced what I've experienced. So to see our group, what we have with our elders group with the Guinevere, is so important. It's a great group we have, and it's a great time we have together. And it's interesting that even when we sit with each other in meetings, and before the meeting starts or during a break, that the conversations we have, I'm learning from them what they went through, and they're learning from me what I went through.
That's right.
So it's important that we get all the information we've got, and I do want to see this implemented within Guinevere. I'm very proud of Guinevere, and where the direction Guinevere is going. I know there's a lot of recordings of the elders have been happening, which is very important. There's been odd suggestions, and I actually brought that up with you earlier, about that when I'm gone, after I pass away, that I still want my recordings to be continued. My voice, I'm a bit hesitant at the moment about my face, and it's a cultural thing too, but it's important that as elders we get all the knowledge we can out, get it all recorded, and in the safe place of Guinevere. And like overall, I think we discussed it this morning before we came here about how the group we've got is the elders group we've got is so strong, and I think it's as you mentioned, probably the strongest one we've got in Australia. Which
well, it's the only governance group of its type at a university in Australia.
That makes me so proud. Makes me so proud that I'm a part of that. And it's on Widjabul land, and fantastic.